Yeah, so welcome everyone. Um, this is the second workshop for Be More Beautiful's Urban Gardening on Vacant Lots virtual workshop series. Um, so last week we learned about how to adopt a vacant lot in Baltimore City, as well as how to turn that space into a vibrant urban garden. Um, and if you were unable to attend last week's workshop and you want to receive a recording of it and you haven't, please shoot me a message and I'm happy to send you the link. Yeah, so tonight we'll be learning all about soil. First of all, we'll be hearing from Marcus Williams about soil testing. And after that, we'll be hearing from Raychel Santo from about John Hopkins Safe Urban Harvest Study, as well as best soil practices for urban farming. So before I introduce our first speaker, there are just a few housekeeping things I wanted to mention. So first of all, as I said in the event email, this presentation is being recorded and will be sent out to all participants after the session ends. While speakers are giving their presentations, please remember to mute your microphone. If you don't, I will mute you, and please don't make me do that. I feel really bad. And we will have a short question and answer session after our speakers present. So please save your questions for then or put them in the chat when you think of them. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce you all to our first speaker. Marcus J. Williams received his Bachelor's of Science degree from Virginia State University in Plant and Soil Science. He also received his Master's of Science degree in Biosecurity and Food Safety from Virginia. He joined AmeriCorps after college and then became an extension agent for Virginia Tech for over 6 years. Coming to Maryland, he worked as a fertilizer and integrated pest management specialist for a medical marijuana company and a soil conservationist with the United States Department of Agriculture and the Natural Resource Conservation Service. He now works with the University of Maryland College Park as an extension agent in Baltimore City, and his specializations include horticulture, community gardens, food deserts, and community outreach. So thank you so much, Marcus, for being here, and feel free to take it away.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Marcus Williams. Sir, first off, if you are thinking about testing your soil, the time to test your soil would be either last month or December. Now is not the best time, but it's a okay time. If you're planning on doing some summer gardening, spring gardening, you're kind of really pushing it because most time our last frost date is, long as the snow cooperates, is around April 15th. But the reason I'm saying you're kind of late because, you know, you take your soil test, you get your results, and then if you want to do some amendment to your soil, you want to give your soil at least a couple months to kind of take hold, make changes in pH, changes in nutrients that are available, and then you want to retest your soil again to see what type of results you had from the changes that you made. But that out the way, I am going to talk about how to do a soil test and then also how to interpret what you get back. So I am going to share my screen and do a quick PowerPoint. Okay. So basically, I'm just going to talk about again how to take a soil test. All right. So why do you want to take a soil test? For the same reason that I said, if you want to add lime to your soil, if you're worried about the soil fertility of your lawns, your garden, your landscape, you don't want to over-fertilize, because if you over-fertilize, that water is going to go, those nutrients are going to go into your groundwater. They're going to run off of your surface. So just applying enough fertilizer is all you really need to do. All right, so I gotta kind of move. All right, so when you take a soil sample, you want to take it, like I said, a few months before. So if you're going to be seeding your lawn, if you're going to be doing a vegetable garden, if you're going to be putting a flower bed, so you know what you're already working with. It's just kind of like if you're a baker. If you were a baker, you're not going to start with a whole bunch of ingredients you don't know how to work with. But you take your soil test. Your soil test is kind of like your ingredients list. So you know what you already have. So you know, I need to add this, I need to add this, I can leave this out, I need to add this and this. And all those are necessary. I'm going to say, we're going to talk a little bit about soil pH. The optimal soil pH for fruits, vegetables, grass is a 6.5. Some people will prefer, now there is different minds on that. Some people prefer a 6.2. Some will go as high as a 6.7. 6.5 is that medium range for me. With 6.5, the reason I say 6.5 is because you have all the nutrients are available to your soil at that 6.5 pH level. If you're growing something like berries, something that's more acidic, you can go down probably, and that's at the range of about 4.5 on the pH scale, 5.5. As you go more acidic and more alkaline, either way that you go, some nutrients aren't going to be available to you because of your change in pH. Sorry. Okay, so I have this here just for you to look at, but I'm going to just talk and just tell you because I do better from that. So if you're taking a soil sample, your established soil, if you're trying to do an established soil, you want to go 2 to 4 inches down into the ground. If you're doing a vegetable and flower garden, 6 to 8 inches, or you want to go tillage depth. And tillage depth changes with the depth of your tillage, with your tillage machine. And if you're doing trees and shrubs, 6 inches. Now, the many tools that you can use, if you're going to take a soil sample, you can use a trowel. I don't use a trowel, but I use a soil probe. A soil probe, I don't have one on me at my house right now because I'm not at the office, but I have a couple different ones there. I have a 6, then you can buy soil probes in the, I bought some new ones, so I'm super jazzed about buying some new ones. And I sound so old talking about I'm happy about buying soil probes, but I promise you they are awesome. So I bought some soil probes that are just for doing raised beds and garden boxes. So they're only like about 2 to 4 inches. So I am super jazzed about those. My other soil probes that I have are anywhere from 6 to 8 inches. So those are the soil probes I usually use, but then I have some smaller ones. I'm like excited. It sounds like a nerd, but I'm excited to have trouble. So how you want to take so I'm going to tell you 2 different ways to take soil samples. All right, so if you're just doing in the ground soil test, 2 things you need to have: either a trowel, which is like a spade is another way to say. You can have a spade, or you can have a soil probe. Both are good, but soil probe is the more efficient one. A trowel is useful as well. And have a bucket. I would tell you where the bucket would come in handy very soon. So I want you to pick an initial spot if you're going to do in the ground in your front yard. So zigzag motion. I want you to take at least 8 samples, 6 to 8 samples. I want you to do a zigzag motion. Take one area, dig down. You want to go underneath of the ground. You don't want to get any grass into your soil sample at all. Number 2, I should say number 1, but number 2 is you want to make sure your soil isn't wet. Because if you're shipping this soil off to a soil lab, you have to remember how long it's going to take to get there, and then it might sit for a day. The reason you don't want to be wet because it might get mildew in it, and those could compromise these soil testing instruments. So you want to take at least 8 samples, zigzag sample here, take 1 here, then take at least another 6 to 8 if you can. The reason being is you want to test different spots in your lawn. If you know you have an area that's got a lot of manure in it, and this is more so if you have animals or if you have like cats, dogs, anything like that. The reason being because that can throw off your pH, or you have an area that you know is wet and you want to send that one off specifically, you can do that. You take all those soil samples that you just taken, you put them all into a bucket. kind of shake that bucket up a little bit. And the reason I say shake that bucket up a little bit is because we want a composite of your soil. It's going to give you a whole view of your soil profile. Also, you can also take that soil, kind of take that lump and just kind of do a ribbon with it. And that will make sure that you went down to the proper depth of your soil. Okay, so the soil labs so the University of Maryland College Park doesn't do soil testing on campus. So you can send your soil sample off to, and I can put this in the chat later of where you can send these soil samples off to: University of Delaware, Penn State University, UMass does soil samples, Spectrum Analysis, and AgriLab also do soil samples. Virginia Tech does do soil tests, but I wouldn't suggest sending it to them because you would be, I guess, second in line because they really only deal with large farmers, and that's what they're really looking for now. So, but they do homeowners, but you wouldn't get your soil test, I think. So farms can get their soil tests back about in a week and a half. If you're a homeowner, you're looking at a 3-week to 4-week time frame to get your soil test back. So that's not a place I would suggest unless you know you had last results. Okay, so your basic soil test is going to test for your pH, your phosphorus, your potassium, your calcium. It's going, which is your PKCAM. You see one thing specifically is left out: your nitrogen. Nitrogen is left out. Specifically, they do test for nitrogen, but nitrogen is very volatile and it leaches very quickly and disperses through the soil, so it's a lot harder to test for. So that's something that you have to pay extra if you're doing a soil test. And the basic soil test also tells you your micro and your macronutrients, which is your sulfur, your magnesium, your zinc, your copper, your iron, your boron. It also tests your organic matter, and also tests your CEC number. Now, without having to bore you to death with chemistry, your cation exchange capacity is what your CEC number is. So I can tell you everything you need to know about it in 2 seconds. Okay. Low CEC number, which means you have a lot of sand in your soil. A higher CEC number means that you have more clay in your soil. So what that means is this. So sandier soils, it's easier to manipulate them and change the pH of them. I know because growing up, I had sandy soils because I'm from the Virginia Beach area. Our soils were a lot more sandier. We were more of, we did a lot of peanut farming, a lot of sweet potatoes, a lot of crops that were more in depth to soil that was a lot sandier. So if you have more clay in your soil, what that means is that you have a higher water holding capacity. So if you've ever gone out in your yard and you can see after it rained that your soil is either a little damp, a little squishy, or you have standing water, that means you have a higher CEC number, you have more clay in your soil. It doesn't mean that your soil is bad. It just means it's harder to manipulate that soil. It's harder to change the pH of that soil. It holds tightly to any kind of ions that it has. And I'm not going to go into the ions because that's the cations, and I'm telling you, that's boring. I struggled through it in chemistry class. I would not push that on anybody else, but if you want to know, I can definitely tell you about it. Okay, so I have a mock soil test. So from this soil test, we see that the pH is a 6.6, which is really good. That you see on right here has so the scale that they have right here, and you can't see my finger, but I'm pointing to it. You have low, medium, optimal. So you see the soil pH is right in the optimal range because it's a 6.6. The phosphorus is at a 73, which is optimal. So let me stop you right here. If that range is optimal, that means you don't have to add any more to it. If you add more to it, you're going to go into the excessive range. Now, that's not saying that you don't ever have to add any more to it, but right now you don't have to add any more to it because once you plant into it, the plant is going to use those nutrients that are available, and you're going to have to replace them come the next growing season. but your potassium, your calcium, your magnesium is all, nope, sorry, your magnesium is in the excessive range. So you should definitely not add any of that to your soil. Everything is about in the optimal range, which is good. Drop down your organic level is, see, I'm just learning now for this area, 3-4 is kind of low because where I'm from in Virginia, we have 0.1 to 0 organic level because we're below sea level. If you dig down to the ground, you're gonna hit water. So your organic level, you could do with a little bit more organic matter, but for the most part is pretty decent. And then you see your CEC number, which is your cation exchange capacity number. And the soil is, if it's anything below 10, it's more along your sandiest soils. So you could add some more organic matter to give it some more water holding capacity to be able to hold on more tightly to nutrients. So they give you suggestions in this soil sample. You told them that you wanted to plant vegetable crops, so you don't have any yield goals, but it tells you to apply 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet of garden. I will say, if anybody can tell me, and it's a specific number, how many square feet are in an acre? I had to learn this because my professor drilled this into my head. Anybody can put in the chat? I can't see the chat right now, so I'm gonna have to believe you when you say it. But 43,560 square feet in an acre. I know that because I had it drilled into my head. But that is the square footage of an acre. So I am going to tell you a shortcut, but we'll get back to that shortcut. I promise you I won't leave it out. So again, I talked about, and this is the same thing I just talked about, what the different soil test tells you. The OM is going to be your organic matter. You basically want your soil test to be in the optimal range. If they're excessive, that definitely means that you shouldn't add any more, and that you might have something going on in your soil, and it's something further to take a look at if you have excessive levels of certain nutrients. There we go, lost my point. Okay, so here's the cheat that I was gonna tell you. So your lab result levels of plant available are usually for P and K, for your fertilizer, are usually in phosphate P2O5 and potash K2 0. So to convert pounds per acre, which is most of your soil tests are going to be in pounds per acre, you can switch them to pounds per square feet. So that's going to be more applicable to if you have a smaller front yard, or if you're just using a smaller garden bed, you would use this math calculation. So again, 43,560 square feet in an acre. So to convert square feet to convert it down to square feet, you would do pounds per acre, which is 43.56 equals pounds and over 1,000 square feet. And if you're trying and use those and if you're doing pounds per acre, 43,005.6 equals pounds per square over pounds over 100 square feet. So that tells you how to do from 1,000 square feet to 100 square feet. And if you have any questions about that, I can help you more. So if you're trying to raise your pH, you're going to want to try to add lime to your soil. Most lime in your area, you're going to find agricultural lime store. You can find that at your Home Depot, at your Lowe's, any of your garden stores, and it's going to be up to 70 pounds of limestone per 1,000 square feet. You can use that equation that I just gave you to figure that out and how much you're supposed to use. You can use a spreader to spread that, or you can get a glove. I've done this before in hand spread, but please use a glove. Don't use bare hands and spread lime. Over time, it's not going to be good for your skin. I wouldn't do it. But yes, you can put on a glove. I've used a plastic glove. I put it on and spread it out that way if you have a smaller yard that you don't want to use so much lime. You want to give that it usually takes some time to change pH. That's why we recommend doing it in December to give your soil some time to actually make a change in pH. And you wouldn't think making a small from 0.5, like if your soil is a say a 7.0, you want to change it to a 6.5, it does take time to go down 0.5. So you want to give your soil enough time to actually make that change. All right, gotta move my picture here. So you're lowering your pH. Sulfur is highly mobile and it's a soluble nutrient prevalent in soils as sulfur and aminos. And that's negative charge again, that's chemistry. I'm not gonna go into that. It's difficult to measure accurately and may be omitted from more soil tests, but in the basic soil test, you'll see that. And most of our Maryland soils are deficient in sulfur because there's a lot less sulfur burning. There's a lot more regulations that people are having to follow. So that's something that you should be noticeable about when you see a soil test. And again, I would not, unless you want burnt hands, touch sulfur with your bare hands. You can put it in a spreader. You're not going to find soil in its raw form. And just like your Home Depot and your garden stores like that, if you have a pesticide license, or if you have your fertilizer certification, which is done through the Maryland Department of Agriculture, you can go to certain specialty stores, you can buy it. But because people were, as the guy explained it to me, because I went to Home Depot and tried to buy it, people were using sulfur and other materials to make things that weren't unsavory, so they stopped selling stuff like that. Because I used to have snakes in my backyard, so I would just put sulfur around the perimeter and that would keep them out. But those things aren't available in these stores anymore. But if you're looking for it and it's just sulfur by itself, you can talk to either Extension or MDA, which is Maryland Department of Agriculture, and they can put you in touch with somebody who can get you that stuff. And that's again talking about the recommendations for if you're converting pounds per acre to 1,000 square feet, or pounds to acre for 100 square feet. All right, so that is my shameless plug. I do get, and again, I promise you, say this is my only shameless plug. We get evaluated on our presentations, so I will send you this if you'd like to rate my performance. You can say, hey, I take all. If it's a bad performance, please tell me so I can make it better. If it's good, I promise you it won't go to my head. But we use this to try to see where we are as far as presenters are concerned. But that is my presentation. If you have any questions or comments or concerns, I can answer them all, I promise you. And I am done.
Yay. Thank you so much, Marcus. Awesome. Well, I know you have to run soon since you're doing the Master Gardener class tonight. But yeah, if you have time for maybe like a couple questions, if anybody has any, feel free to unmute yourself or put them in the chat.
I have a question. This is Andrea. Hi. I'm just curious because I've used and I've been told it's good for soil if you have access to wood ash, but does that raise or lower the pH of soil? Do you know?
So that's going to lower your pH.
It's going to lower the pH.
Yeah, it's going to lower the pH, but you don't want to use too much.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. And I put my email in the chat. If you might have a question later on, you can definitely shoot it to me there and ask me.
I have a question.
Okay.
I planted blueberry plants as well as a blueberry bush, and because I know it needs acidic soil, so what I did was I planted them under a what is a spiky tree?
An azalea?
No, the one with the pine cones on it.
Oh, a pine tree.
I planted it under there because of the needles falling to the ground. Does that change the soil as well? Like, does that matter?
I wouldn't have planted underneath that pine tree because those two plants are going to be competing for nutrients. I would have planted it a little bit farther away, but both of those are acidic area where they're thriving low acid, but it also depends on what type of blueberry you have, whether you have a bush type or you either have a bush type or a high oleic type of blueberry. And it should have said that on your
what's the higher layer?
High oleic is the type that are more of they're not vining, but they're more of they just grow straight up. They don't grow out, they grow up.
Okay, so I planted both.
Okay.
That one is going to be more of a plant like, right? Because I actually planted a bush and then I actually they said they're blueberry plants, so they're not going to grow into a big bush. They're for small areas. So, but what I did was I put them in a pot and I put the bush directly in the ground, but I put them both under the pine, whatever that tree is, because of the acid.
I would check if you can check your pH. You want that pH for that blueberry to be around a 4.5 or 5.0.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Somebody asked, what soil lab would you recommend? As Marcus, the extension agent, I can't endorse a specific soil lab, but as Marcus, just a person, I graduated from Virginia Tech. So I would say Virginia Tech soil lab is great, but I would use a university soil lab because they're cheaper. I would just say that. I'm not endorsing any specific soil lab at all. So I can say this, as an extension agent, they're all great. As Marcus, the person, I would prefer a university soil testing lab.
Cool. Are there any more questions anyone has? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Marcus. Yay. Great. Well, I'll see you in maybe a half hour in class.
Yes. Y'all have a good day.
Thanks again. Thank you everyone for those great questions. So now we'll move on to our next speaker. Raychel Santo is a Senior Research Program Coordinator at the John Hopkins Center for a Liveable Future, where she works on several research projects related to urban agriculture, local and regional food policy, and the relationships between food and climate change. Raychel earned her master's degree in food, space, and society from Cardiff University School of Geography and Planning, and her bachelor degree in public health, environmental change, and sustainability from John Hopkins University. So thank you so much for being here, Raychel, and feel free to take it away whenever you're ready.
Thanks for inviting me, Morgan, and it's nice to see everyone, and welcome to the world of gardening for those of you who are new. I first started gardening when I was in college and fell in love with it and have done various projects in my academic career, but also I'm a community gardener in my free time too, and a master gardener too, actually, I should say that too. So anyway, gardening is an important part of my life, and I hope you all will find it is yours as well. So Marcus presented a lot about nutrient testing of soil, and I want to make sure that when you think about soil testing, you think about it in two ways. So there's one, it's the nutrients for the plants so that they can grow well, and those are a lot of the nutrients that Marcus went over, and typically you'll do a nutrient test probably once a year, a growing season. You might even do it more often if you're really trying to figure out your pH or something like that. I'm going to talk today about metals testing, or things you don't want in your soil. And so sometimes you can get some nutrient tests that also have metals in them, and sometimes you have to pay for extra to get extra tests to do the metals in your soil. And so I'll talk through why this is a potential concern, especially in urban areas, but honestly, metals can be in rural soils too. And there's a lot of historical use of agricultural pesticides, even 100 years ago, that had lead and arsenic in them. So there's widespread contamination of our soils everywhere. And so this is something that we need to be concerned about for our health and for the health of anyone who's interacting in your garden. So I'm just going to share my screen and start out here. And I'm part of, today I'm going to be presenting the results of a study that we actually did over the past 4 years specifically on safety in urban agriculture and related to metals. And it's called the Safe Urban Harvest Study. And then I'm going to spend about 10 minutes going over best practices that we've compiled based on our study results. There is a whole team of people behind the Safe Urban Harvest Study, and I'm just one of the staff members on the team. But as you can see, we have the principal investigator is Keith Nachman, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and we have a whole number of research assistants, graduate students who helped us. We had some partners at the USDA Agricultural Research Service, other faculty in the Hopkins School of Public Health, some faculty members at the University of Illinois who were doing a similar study there. And also, most importantly, our study was conducted in partnership with 4 community organizations, the Baltimore Office of Sustainability, the University of Maryland Extension, Baltimore City, Parks and People Foundations, a former Community Greening Resource Network, but now it's just the Parks and People Foundation, and the Farm Alliance of Baltimore. This study was entirely designed, conducted, and interpreted with the help of our community partners. All right, so I'm going to present a brief overview of our study and what we found, and then we will go into some best practices for growing safely. And so firstly, I just want to acknowledge that we recognize at the center that there are many, many benefits to growing food in cities. One of the strongest benefits being the community aspect. There's a lot of research showing the community benefits of bringing people together to grow food, often from multiple different generations, and exchanging cultural traditions, keeping knowledge of how to grow food alive is really important. There are also environmental sustainability benefits, there are public health benefits as growers, and there's also potential economic development benefits, including increased property values in areas that have robust green spaces, including urban farms and community gardens, and also potential supplemental employment at urban farms, or for people who are growing their own food as a gardening adventure, you could save several $100s a year on produce. So we recognize all of these benefits, and there are also potential challenges. And one of the biggest ones or biggest concerns that people raise is potential contaminants in urban soils. And as many of you know, living in a city like Baltimore, which has a robust post-industrial history, we had a lot of processing in the city. We were a vibrant hub of shipping and manufacturing back in the 1700s and 1800s, one of the biggest cities in the country at the time. The remnants of that mean that there are historical contaminants in our soils here. And our study was focused on heavy metals, things like lead, arsenic, cadmium, chromium. There are other chemicals that could be present too. There's like alphabet soup, so I'm just going to tell you what they are, but we actually didn't study them and they're really expensive to test. So this is kind of why we still share our best practices, even though, spoiler alert, our study results look pretty good overall. But we didn't test for any of these other things, so they could still be there. And so it's still important to be cognizant of how you're interacting with soil, just to make sure you're being as safe as you can, especially if you have children on site or pregnant women on site, because their bodies are more vulnerable to potential contaminants. So just so you know what these other chemicals are, if you want to look them up later, don't freak yourself out, but like volatile organic compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, I can't even remember PCBs anymore, pesticides. A lot of these are byproducts of industry or cars and gasoline. So you'll tend to find them in specific locations depending on the historical use of the site. But also if you're next to a heavily trafficked roadway that's been there for a long time, they could be there too. And there's potential ways that we can be exposed to these metals. You can have it touch your skin, and there's some that are absorbed through the skin. Inhalation is a common one, especially with dust. So one of the good practices some people say is to make sure if it's really not rained in a long time that you're really careful, because the dust can stir up a lot when you're gardening. And ingestion, accidental is most common for most adults. You might be like brushing your sleeve and then some soil goes into your mouth or face, or if you didn't wash your produce thoroughly. Children might also just be like eating the soil. So that's why it's especially important to pay attention to children. And so we had heard from the community leading up to this study, people were concerned that growing fruits and vegetables in the city could be dangerous. So we wanted to ask that question: how do metals in urban grown fruits and vegetables compare to those from fruits and vegetables from the grocery stores and farmers markets. Is there actually a difference? And if so, what can we do to change it? And there have also been concerns raised that urban soils can be contaminated and risky for the people who are growing in the food, so not growing the food. So not just the people eating it, but also just being active in the soil, planting things, shoveling, ingesting it accidentally. Are those people who are growing in urban soils exposed to soil contaminants at unacceptable rates? So these were kind of our two big driving questions to conduct our study. So we wanted to collect actual evidence to answer these questions about the risk of urban agriculture in Baltimore, but also to answer some broader questions, because this isn't just a concern in Baltimore. There are a lot of places around the world who are having similar concerns. And we wanted to provide participants with site-specific results and interpretation. So if you send your soils off for a metals test, you're not going to get as thorough of analysis as we've done, which means it's good and bad. So the good thing is it means you're going to get your soil test back probably in like a month. It took us over a year to get everything back because we had so many samples. We were going through a lab at USDA that had a lot of other projects going on, and it took us a long time to analyze them and compare them to recommended levels. So there's benefits, positives, and negatives, but we can kind of summarize the overall findings for you. And so we did a survey of the common practices in urban agriculture sites in Baltimore. And then we collected irrigation water samples, soil samples, and produce samples to both characterize the metals exposure risks faced by people who are growing in the soil and also people who are eating the food grown in urban soils. So now we're going to go over just a few of the study findings. Big picture, soil. Just so you know, there are a lot of different numbers. If you're sending your soil off for tests, there are going to be a lot of numbers that you can find about how to interpret the results. And we have a graduate student who's working on this as their dissertation, but basically none of these numbers are perfect because none of them are really optimized for the particular use of growing as a community garden or an urban farm and how that affects people's health at those sites. The best that we could find were called the New York Soil Cleanup Objectives. And these are numbers that are intended to be like the maximum that would suggest that you should then further analyze at your site. So they're not saying that if you go over it, it's like code red, you should not be there. It just means that like this would recommend testing again and doing a more thorough analysis to find out more info about your site. But we chose it because they take into account gardening at someone's house and the exposure that they would have through gardening, at least on a regular basis. But there's some problems with them. They're not perfect numbers. You don't need to memorize them or anything. I just wanted to include them here in case you do get your soil tested and are trying to figure out what do these numbers mean. They don't always interpret them for you. So wanted to have them so you knew what numbers we were using. The one you'll probably have heard the most about is lead at 400 parts per million. That's a pretty common number, more common than some of the rest of these. There's even debate over whether that's too high, and some people say, it should be much lower, like at 100. I guess it depends on how comfortable you are with risk. And so we could talk about that further if you have questions. So here are our big picture results. Oh man, I'm sad that this didn't show. I had this like thing covering up the lead, but oh well. Okay, so big picture, we had, I forgot to mention, we have 104 farms and gardens in the study. And so that's from across Baltimore City, about 76% of the sites that we thought we could be eligible at the time. And so this is a summary figure of our results. Each dot represents the average metal concentration of that metal at a site for the particular type of soil. So each type of soil has 104 dots representing each of the 104 sites. The growing area samples are the furthest to the left, the brown areas. These are areas where people are actively growing your fruits and vegetables. This is probably if you're starting a garden where you're going to test your soil. You're probably not going to test the pathway soils or the undisturbed soils, but we wanted to because we wanted to know more about health exposure and risk exposure. So we wanted to see, okay, if somebody is like kneeling in soil that's right next to the garden bed, is it any different? Are they going to be ingesting dust from there that could be higher than what the actual soil that they might be, remediating and cleaning up? Could it be different? So that's why we tested it. You probably would only be testing your growing areas. The good news is, as you see, so the line, the dotted line that goes across is 100%. So that's the limit you want to stay below if you can. But again, if you're above it, it doesn't mean that like everything's horrible and that you're gonna, get immediately sick or anything like that. It's more, okay, let's go back, let's test more, let's find out what's causing this. And as you can see for most of the sites, Cadmium wasn't even detected in like hardly any samples, so we don't even present it here. So in the case of barium, cadmium, and nickel, the results look really great. Arsenic, there's one site that had like a slightly high level, and otherwise not a big problem. And honestly, this number is debated by some members of my team right now because of the way it was calculated. So we're still working that one out, but essentially arsenic was not a problem either. And lead, for the most part, actually looked really good. There were 4 sites where the average lead concentration was higher than the soil cleanup objective, but we went back to those sites and tested again and found where the level was high. I should also mention, you know how Marcus talked about taking multiple scoops from your area so that you're representing the area. So taking multiple samples, mix them together. That's what we did. These are growing area mixtures. So they're not, any one sample doesn't represent one spot. It actually represents 6 to 12 spots on a site. And so when we saw these high levels, we went back and tested in more detail to find out if it was one particular area that was high or wasn't, and helped work with the sites to identify that. And based on that, we're not super concerned about the lead levels. And the one metal that was a little concerning at first, but I promise you it will actually not be that concerning once we talk through it, is chromium. At over half of the sites, we found chromium concentrations in the growing area soils were higher than the recommended limit, the guideline. So we were like, wow, hadn't heard about this or didn't really know much about it. So we wanted to look into it more. And an important caveat with this data is that we only were able to measure what's called total chromium, because of the limits of our testing capabilities, and it's really expensive to do what's called speciating. But basically, chromium exists in 2 forms: trivalent chromium and hexavalent chromium. If you've ever seen Erin Brockovich, she fought against the hexavalent chromium that was contaminating her water in that area of California. That's a very harmful kind of chromium, not beneficial in any amount. It's mostly associated with industrial pollution, and it also tends to be found in water. Trivalent chromium is less harmful and actually beneficial in small amounts. We actually need a very small amount of it. And I wouldn't say go eat your soil to get it, but like in produce, it's actually considered an essential nutrient. And it's naturally occurring, and it's more likely to be found in soil. And so we sent off our samples, because we were a little concerned about the chromium, to a chromium expert at the Environmental Protection Agency, who was able to speciate them using this really fancy machine. And he found that all the chromium was the non-harmful kind, the trivalent kind. So we all breathed a sigh of relief. Everyone kind of walked away, okay, chromium's not majorly an issue. So honestly, it's not a test that would be available over the counter to any of you. So if you are looking into testing your soil, don't even bother with chromium, because unless you're really concerned that like you're near an industrial site that could be leaching chromium from the water, it's probably not going to be a problem, and it's really expensive to test. I think it's like several $100s per sample. So probably not worth your time and effort. And also a big sigh of relief for us is that serpentine soils are soils that are naturally high in chromium. If you look at the map of the US, Baltimore's like right in the center with where serpentine soils are naturally occurring. So it makes sense. It's honestly one of the reasons that Baltimore became a hub of chromate processing back in the 1800s, is because our soils are naturally high in chromium. So anyway, big news is we're not too concerned about that. The one big takeaway would be that there is lead in our urban environment, including in our soils. We rarely found high levels of lead in the growing area soils of the sites that we tested. And at those sites, we worked harder with the sites to identify where the potential contamination was happening. One site, it was near a building that was being demolished, and the potentially former lead paint that was on the walls could have been, becoming dust and then settling on the farm. At another site, I think they were close to rain barrel that was leaching some lead into their soil. But anyway, we worked with those sites to identify where the lead was. And we also, for everyone, have provided guidance about non-expensive, effective ways to reduce your exposure. And I'll talk through those later today. And again, we're not concerned about the chromium we found. Big picture takeaways from the water, metals and irrigation water were not concerning at most sites. We compared the metals that we found, the levels that we found, to drinking water guidelines, so being very conservative in our approach. And even that, we found that almost all the sites met drinking water guidelines, which is great. I mean, most people aren't drinking their drinking water or their irrigation water, but if it's safe enough to be drinking water, we're confident it's safe enough to be irrigation water. There are a few sites, I think like 3 or 4, where there were slightly higher levels of lead in the water. And we, again, identified the source of contamination to a rain barrel from a roof that might have been contaminated, or we resampled the site and observed a decrease in the level of metals. And I'll mention this actually happened at a site where they knew that the water was contaminated inside, and we're just using it as irrigation water, but weren't drinking it because they already knew it was contaminated. And one thing that we found is, so we took our sample at the beginning of the growing season, so the water hadn't been running much. Well, there's a potential for metals to build up in pipes when the water hasn't been running much. And so we came back a month and a half later and retested. And after that, the metals went way down, which gives us one of our recommendations, which is to leave the water on at the beginning of the growing season. If you're using municipal water, let it flush for like 10 minutes or so to kind of get some of those metals out before you start using it as irrigation water. And even though almost all the samples were safe enough to drink, from a metals perspective, we still recommend not drinking the water from rain barrels and also from hoses, because there could be potentially harmful bacteria in there that we did not test for. So even though we're talking about metals, just want to warn you, like, even if it's safe enough to drink, probably not a great idea. You don't want to get some microbe in your system. And lastly, I know I'm running short on time, so I'm gonna skip quickly over this. And if you have questions, which is probably will, because it's kind of a lot, let me know. So produce, some big picture realities that are important to walk away with from today. And it's hard, it was actually kind of shocking to me when I first came to this project, is that there are low levels of metals in all of the foods we eat. You can't avoid eating metals. And unlike soil, there are no recommended guidelines or limits to stay under for a specific fruit or vegetable, or actually most foods. So without these limits, it's hard to interpret exactly what is safe and what isn't. So one of the reasons, one of the things we did was compare the produce that we tested to produce from grocery stores and farmers markets. So we could have a better, more accurate comparison to what we've been consuming our whole lives. And key takeaways. There were no meaningful differences between urban grown produce and produce from grocery stores and farmers markets. So that's great. That's like good news for urban growers everywhere, or at least in Baltimore. I guess we didn't test it everywhere, but concentrations of barium, cadmium, and nickel were negligible and not a concern to us at all. This is the hardest one, and I'm happy to talk to you about it if you want. I just want to get to the best practices. So let me know and we can dig more into it. But lead was in all the produce we found pretty much. And there was also some arsenic in the produce. There's also arsenic in rice, and we debated over whether we could compare the relative amount in vegetables to arsenic in rice. It's complicated, but if you're concerned about arsenic, focus on rice in your diet, because that's going to be probably your greatest source. And there were some notable differences by produce type too, which we can get into, but I'm going to try to skim over the section. So here I just want to show you an illustrative example of what we mean when we say there are no major differences between arsenic levels in urban grown produce and produce from grocery stores. So on the far left, blue dots for each produce item we tested. You see the urban samples and the concentration, and then you see the next one are rural farmers market samples we took, and then the next one is grocery store conventional samples we took, and the next one grocery store organic. And I don't want you to get focused on the numbers or anything like that, but just big picture, as you can see that, like, in almost every case, there are a few outliers, but we don't believe that there's any meaningful reason to interpret those outliers. But in almost every case, you know, the ranges of potential concentrations are pretty much the same for every produce item. And so for us, that means to us, there's no meaningful differences. And we did do some statistical tests too, but I think it's easier to visually demonstrate that there's no substantial differences. It's not like urban is way off the charts and everything else is lower or something like that. We did the same thing for lead, and as you'll see here, very similar comparisons in that, like, the range for most of the products was pretty similar. As you will notice on the far right, beets, carrots, potatoes, and sweet potatoes had higher concentrations, and this was across the board at all types. In fact, sweet potatoes, the urban sweet potatoes actually looked better than grocery store conventional and grocery store organic, or even farmers market sweet potatoes. So I wouldn't read too much into that. I wouldn't be like, I'm only going to eat urban sweet potatoes now. It could have just been a number of factors. But the big takeaway to us is that the differences between urban grown produce and grocery stores and farmers market produce is not substantial. And the other big takeaway is that if you are concerned about metals in your diet, one potential area to reduce them is varying up your produce so that you're not just eating root vegetables all the time. We don't want to tell people like stop eating fruits and vegetables and stop eating root vegetables, because there are many, many proven benefits to eating fruits and vegetables. And so our big takeaway is that keep eating a diet rich in fruits and vegetables. The health risks that could result from cutting those out of your diet would likely be greater than the trace metals that are found in those foods. It doesn't mean that like these are not concerning at all, but like big picture, people have been eating these fruits and vegetables their entire lives, and the types of risks that we're talking about are very long-term risks. We're not talking about any type of an immediate risk from consuming one of these products. In fact, not a single sample in our study had a high enough concentration that if you ate it, you would get sick immediately. It's nothing like that. We're talking like long-term cancer risk potential. And even that, there's still so many benefits to fruits and vegetables that have been proven for a long time with cancer and other potential diseases that this doesn't say anything to suggest that we should change our habits on that. It's just we wanted to know that urban wasn't necessarily worse. If you are concerned about metals, focus on reducing your soil contact. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide. And that's because the concentrations that we were looking at in metals, in soils, are parts per million. And those that we were looking at in produce are parts per billion. So the difference of this is like 1 drop in a bucket is parts per million, and 1 drop in a pool is parts per billion. So the concentration is much higher in the soil. So if you were accidentally to ingest some soil, you're going to get a lot more metals exposure than if you were to ingest produce that had a small amount in parts per billion. And lastly, our study found that with rare exceptions, growers can continue practicing urban agriculture safely in Baltimore City. And so here are the best practices that we have emphasized to everyone moving forward. Even if your soil looks fantastic from a metals perspective, it's still good to do this just because it's generally good practices. And also, again, we didn't test for all the other potential contaminants that could be there. And that would be really expensive for you to test as well. So for soil, because we want to focus on reducing soil exposure in particular, don't allow children to eat soil or crawl in soil. I would say this is pretty much a universal standard, even if it's not in a garden. Like I wouldn't do this anywhere in Baltimore City, to be honest. Reduce your skin contact with soil, wear gloves, long pants, long sleeves. Honestly, I'm bad at this myself. I don't like wearing gloves when I'm gardening, but I try really hard not to put my hands in my mouth or near my mouth or scratch my nose or something when I'm gardening and I have a bunch of soil on my hands. Avoid bringing soil into your home. Wash your hands, remove your shoes, dust off the soil from your clothes before you come in, or your tools or your produce. I know I'm really guilty of having a bunch of soil like in the bottom of my garden bag as I'm walking in, and it just like gets in our foyer and it's really annoying, but that's potentially going to spread it through your home if you're not careful with it. So as much as you can, brush it off, like make sure your produce is sort of clean at least before you come back home, and do the best you can to like, even if it does get in your house, either wet mop is a recommended good practice for reducing lead exposure and dust, instead of dry sweeping where it can get back up into the air and you can breathe it, or use a vacuum with a HEPA filter. I think that's what it's called. But again, best, even if you only have a broom and a dustpan, like that's better than leaving it on the floor and spreading around your home all over the place. And if possible, grow in imported soil or soil that you bring from offsite that has been tested for metals. And we can get into the complicated nature of this if you want. We have a guide on how to buy soil and compost and where to find out if it's been tested before on our website. And ideally in raised beds or some type of way to lift the soil up from the natural soil that it's on. So you can put landscaping fabric at the bottom. You might have already tested your soil and know that it's not high in metals, and then maybe you don't need to do this at all. But if you're not sure, you can there are 2 ways you could go about this. You could go test your soil for metals, and I can talk about how expensive that is if you want. Or you could just decide, like I don't want to bother with it. I'm just going to build a raised bed and not worry about it. And you can do that. And then maybe test your soil for lead like the first time you put it in, and then maybe a couple of years later, you probably don't have to worry about it as much as if you're growing directly in ground. With produce, our biggest takeaway is wash and peel your produce, especially root vegetables, before eating. The levels we looked at were with peeled root vegetables. So that's how high it was even after peeling it. And part of it is just root vegetables are grown in soil. They're more likely to get metals in them than a tomato on top. But the other thing is that root vegetables are also more dense. So the concentration is going to look a little higher because they're more dense anyway, but even accounting for concentration, we still found them to be higher. So it's good to peel them if you can. And also vary where you get your produce, and also I should say what types of produce. So you're not, I mean, as much as I love sweet potatoes or potatoes, like don't eat them for every meal. Try to vary it up. Try to incorporate some lettuce, some kale, some just eggplant, any type of vegetable you want, but try to make sure that your diet is varied, and that will be good for your health too. And in terms of water, don't drink from the water on the site, rain barrel or hose, just for bacteria concerns. And let your municipal water, your city water, run for 10 minutes at the beginning of the season, as we mentioned. It's called flushing. And then each time you use it after that, it's ideal to do it for 1 to 2 minutes if you can. If you can't, at least do it for 30 seconds. And I'll mention that we have our website here. I'm also happy to share the link, Morgan, with you afterwards if it's easier to send out in a follow-up email. You can also just Google Safe Urban Harvest Study, and it'll probably get you there faster than typing in this whole URL. But we have some tips and resources there, including our best practices guide, which is in more detail than what I've shared today, but kind of walks you through every potential step you could do to make sure you're safe. A guide to testing your soils for heavy metals, and I'm actually going to preview this because I know, I'll just like show you really quick. Let me see if I can escape this. And then we have an FAQ about buying soil and compost. I just want to show you, in case it's helpful, we have this guide that we've created that walks through the different soil labs that we've found about and shows you which different metals they test for and how much they cost. At least when we did this, I think it was in 2019, so it might cost a little bit more, but this can be helpful if you're also trying to test your soil for nutrients too. I know University of Delaware has a program, so you can see, oh, we could also test in their heavy metal screening test. So you could send your same samples for both nutrient testing and heavy metal testing. I will say that heavy metal testing is expensive. So in this guide that's on our website, here's the website, and you go to Safe Urban Harvest Study and you go down, you can see our resources and the guide to testing for heavy metals. In this guide, we talk about how to take a metals test. It's pretty similar to the same thing that Marcus shared, but if you want it written down, it's all in here. And we also talk about the potential cost and why you might not want to do it all the time. Every year, it'd be pretty expensive. So we recommend doing it when you're first starting out once, just to kind of get a grip on where you are. And then if you have any reason to think that like the soil has changed substantially, maybe test it again. But otherwise, like every 3-4 years is probably fine, and you'll probably be safe enough. There's not a huge evidence to suggest that there's a lot of airborne deposition, unless you're near a building that's being demolished or something. Probably not a major concern to just get it every couple years. So with that, I'm going to stop. I know I went a little bit over, but please let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them or walk through anything else that was shared or not shared.
Anyone have any questions at all? Okay, well, thank you so much, Rachel. That was incredible and eye-opening on so many levels. And yes, I will share all of those links that you shared with us. And Jerome says, no question, but an excellent presentation. That was absolutely excellent. Thank you for running through all of that. Yeah, so last chance if anyone thinks of any questions right now. Okay. Well, yay. Well, thank you so much once again. And yes, so as we wrap up our time together tonight, I want to thank everyone again for coming out. And just remind you all that we'll have 2 more subsequent workshops for the next 2 Thursdays at 6 p.m. Our next workshop next week will be on crop planning and propagation, where we'll be hearing from Master Gardener Nara Nanjit. So please, if you haven't already signed up for that, I'll send out a link to the Eventbrite with my follow-up email. And yeah, also feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And yeah, thanks again for coming, and hope to see you next week. Thank you for our presenters. Yes.
Thanks, Morgan, and thank you all. I hope good luck with your gardening.
Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.